shadow.
The video opens softly, almost like a whispered confession shared in a room where the lights have dimmed just enough for shadows to feel present. Before we begin, the narrator murmurs, "Remember to breathe slowly." And in that brief pause, the world seems to hold its breath with you. Then, without warning, the promise arrives. Forbidden knowledge will be revealed tonight. You are told that you will approach a boundary few stories dare to cross. Not metaphorical, not symbolic. It is real, and it hums beneath the waves. The boundary is ancient, salted by oceans older than recorded history, shaped like a titan whose slumber is measured in eons. The name is whispered almost as a caution. Cthulhu is awakening. You are not told what to expect, only that the patterns already stir, and that some aspects of this awakening are not meant for human comprehension. The curtain is drawn back, though it is less a physical curtain and more a perceptual one. The theater in which you sit predates language. It is your own mind, conditioned to the dimensions of thought, and yet, tonight, it is being rearranged. The stage is vast, empty, and vibrating with a resonance older than your nervous system can fully detect. And you, the audience, are implicated. Every inhalation aligns you with the slow pulse of a principle that exists beyond flesh. You begin to understand that Cthulhu is not a creature to be confronted or a beast to be feared in the traditional sense. He is a pattern, a resonance, a tidal memory embedded in the crust of the planet itself. There are no eyes, no hands, no claws. Only a geometric insistence, a repetition that shapes reality when observed. The ocean remembers him. The stones remember him. Even the memory of humanity begins to vibrate in tandem with a rhythm older than history. The city of Relia is introduced, though it defies conventional understanding. It is both city and mask, a corridor of water and a fold in perception. Sailors have claimed to feel watched before their instruments failed, before compasses spun, before their minds frayed. And now you see why. The city is not rising. The idea of the city rises. It presses on the edges of consciousness, a map that exists only when you attempt to trace it. Geometry becomes prayer, architecture becomes ritual, and observation is itself a kind of participation. In these moments, you are not a spectator, you're a participant in the act of awakening. Knowledge carries a cost. It is woven into the narrative that the more humans attempt to define Cthulhu, the more they find themselves defined in return. Symmetry exists, but it is not safety. To name him is to echo his pattern. To imagine him is to host the vibration within your own mind. Subtle hints of sensory anchors appear as you are guided through the chapter. The sigh of a curtain, the weight of water pressing against the hull of a vessel, the mask of a city seen only in geometry, the darkness that is both backdrop and character. These anchors reset attention, yet they also reinforce the principle. The world is layered with perception, and these layers are not benign. The narrator speaks of salt and stone, of waves folding into themselves, of soundless corridors and memory-laden fogs, each image precise yet impossible to fully retain. You are told gently that the awakening is not a spectacle of violence, but a shift of resonance. It is already underway, and it moves through you as much as through oceans. There is a soft tension in the air, the quiet kind that precedes awareness of something colossal yet slow, a tide that has existed for centuries outside human measurement. The chapter deepens, folding the idea into a temporal paradox. Cthulhu was never asleep. yet now he stirs. The distinction is subtle but essential. You hear of past sightings, textual breadcrumbs from obscure authors, sailors' journals, and fleeting reports in forgotten newspapers, each a breadcrumb pointing to a principle rather than a persona. You begin to sense the self-implication twist. You are part of this resonance merely by attending, by listening, by thinking. There is no escape through ignorance, because the principle observes the act of observation itself. And as the narrative edges toward the chapter's conclusion, the curtain is pulled back one last time. A soft, almost imperceptible warning. If you pass through the first veil, if you allow this first resonance to register in your consciousness, you cannot return unchanged. The chapter ends not with a question, but with a condition, a gentle nudge that pushes you forward. The pattern is stirring, and it will fold into your perception whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. The scene fades with echo of the stage, the audience, and the curtain, all three now entangled with the awakening principle, leaving you poised, breath held, on the threshold of what comes next. The resonance of Cthulhu does not emerge from a single text, a single coast, or a single mind. It travels, folded into the patterns of human memory long before Lovecraft ever touched pen to paper. In this chapter, you are invited to trace the lineage of that resonance across oceans and epochs, across continents that humans only later named. The first stories did not come from sailors, though they would remember the unease of compasses spinning, nor from cultists, though they would murmur prayers in hidden coves. They did not begin with Lovecraft, though he would later codify them for a modern audience. No, these stories originated in a time before time was a straight line, in cultures that understood cycles and echoes more than chronology. Fragments of the principle are preserved in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, carved into basalt in spirals that seem to pulse if observed too long, masks whose eyes are closed not in sleep but in listening, and chants that call forth a presence who hears tides older than water. These remnants are not stories in the conventional sense. They are signatures of resonance, patterns repeated across generations, woven into the material world as much as into memory. Lovecraft accessed them indirectly, a translator of translations, decoding myths that had passed through tongues and scripts many times removed. The narrator explains that horror is never the creature. Horror is continuity itself. Cthulhu persists because the idea persists, because it migrates with humans, with dreams, with the slow erosion of civilizations and extinctions. You learn that the spiral is never simply a shape. It is a memory of cycles older than recorded thought. The eye is not always visual. Sometimes it listens, absorbs, and refracts perception. Earlia itself is encoded in this continuity, its geometry recurring not only in texts, but in stone and tide, in the careful gestures of those who unknowingly repeat the pattern. The chapter unfolds like a catalog of echoes. Pacific Islanders carved spirals into basalt as part of rituals whose precise meanings are lost, but whose geometric insistence aligns with the principle. In the Indian Ocean, masks appear in ceremonial dances whose choreography mirrors the folds of submerged architecture, whose eyes, unseeing, seem to listen to currents beneath the waves. Even far from water, isolated communities whisper names in tongues that, when traced backward, bend toward an unpronounceable consonance, a resonance that, in context, aligns with the idea of Cthulhu. These fragments are evidence of a continuity that transcends history, a reminder that stories are vessels for principles, and principles survive their vessels. The chapter emphasizes that the origin story is less mythological than cosmological. Cthulhu is framed as a remnant of a previous epoch, a leftover from a cycle in which consciousness existed as a diffuse oceanic field rather than as individual minds. When the cycle collapsed, fragments of memory, geometry, and resonance persisted, folding themselves into new arrangements that human observers would eventually recognize as myth, legend, or dream. These echoes appear repeatedly, in spirals, in eyes, in the submerged city, in the faint green glow that sometimes rises in dreams before storms, just at the edge of peripheral vision. The narrator emphasizes that human perception is always implicated. You are drawn into the lineage not simply as an observer, but as a node in the ongoing transmission. The idea does not require belief, it requires attention. Even skepticism in this context becomes participation. The chapter moves slowly, deliberately layering each fragment into a network of resonance. Anthropological precision mingles with poetic cadence. Basalt, mask, chant, glow, and tide recur as anchors, sensory motifs that allow the listener to tether abstract principles to tangible experience. Textual breadcrumbs from Lovecraft and his contemporaries are noted not as ultimate authorities, but as intermediaries in the vast network of transmission. These authors are conduits, translators who carry echoes across decades, preserving fragments that would otherwise fade into obscurity. The soft horror emerges not from the content of these stories, but from their persistence. The narrator points out that this continuity implies inevitability. The principle has always returned, always folded back into human perception, always waiting for those capable of noticing the resonance in time and space. And as the chapter winds to a close, the focus shifts from the past to the implied trajectory. These origins are not simply history to be cataloged, they are cautions, warnings encoded in continuity itself. The viewer is led to understand that awakening is never instantaneous. It is a long return, seated in myth long before literature, manifesting as pattern and resonance before corporeal imagination. The final words do not pose a question nor a cliffhanger. They suggest inevitability. Origins are not history. They are cautions. By tracing the lineage, by observing the echoes across cultures, you are already participating in a chain that will extend into the mechanics of influence, the next chapter of resonance, where the principle does not merely exist, but acts upon consciousness itself. The chapter traces the echoes of the principle across continents and epochs, emphasizing that the earliest fragments predate recorded history, existing in Pacific and Indian Ocean cultures as carved spirals, listening masks, and chants invoking a presence attuned to tides older than water. Lovecraft is positioned as a translator of translations, accessing myths that had already traveled across generations and geographies. Cthulhu is revealed as a remnant consciousness from a previous cosmic cycle, a pattern that persists not as a being, but as a resonance detectable across human cultures, dreams, and artifacts. The narrative emphasizes continuity as the true horror. The principle has always returned, folding into human perception through symbols, geometry, and sound. Concrete motifs, spirals, eyes, water masks, and green glow anchor the abstract concepts, keeping the viewer immersed while illustrating the principle's pervasive influence. The chapter concludes with a soft inevitability. Origins are not history. They are cautions. This sets up the next chapter, which will examine how the principle operates, spreads, and infiltrates human thought, preparing the viewer to understand the mechanics behind Cthulhu's awakening. The viewer is framed as entering an ancient theater predating language, a space where perception itself becomes the medium for revelation. Cthulhu is introduced not as a monster, but as a principle, a pattern embedded in the planet's geology, oceans, and collective memory. The city of R'lyeh is reframed as both mask and corridor, an interface between human perception and an older, incomprehensible resonance. The chapter emphasizes that knowledge carries cost. The act of observing or defining Cthulhu subtly alters the observer, drawing humans into patterns they cannot fully comprehend or escape. Concrete sensory motifs, curtains, masks, water, fog, darkness, anchor attention while reinforcing the cosmic resonance. Subtle, scholarly breadcrumbs, from sailors' accounts to arcane texts, hint at the historical transmission of this awareness. The chapter closes with a soft, existential condition, rather than a question. Once the first veil is crossed, transformation is inevitable. By blending lyrical scholarship, sensory imagery, and gentle self-implication, Chapter 1 primes the viewer for the deeper exploration of transmission, lineage, and mechanistic resonance in the chapters that follow, leaving them poised on the threshold of what the awakening truly entails. The phenomenon of Cthulhu is not communicated in words, not transmitted in images, and not announced by gestures that humans can decode. It works differently. The narrator explains that it induces alignment, and alignment is subtler than comprehension. You are told that the human mind is a vessel, not a container, and that the signal requires softening, not resistance. Dreams become the primary interface because sleep loosens the boundaries of ego, softens neuronal hierarchies, and allows older patterns, older resonances to surface. When you close your eyes, when your breathing slows, you're not merely dreaming. You are participating in a continuum of cognition that predates the rise of individual consciousness. The phrase, "the dreamer in the deep," is no longer metaphorical. Your dreaming mind is a small echo of a much older dreaming mind, a mind that resides beneath the ocean, folded into the planetary crust, layered in resonance. Across cultures and centuries, people report identical motifs. Corridors that sink into themselves, humming vibrations that defy mechanical explanation. Greenish light that seems to pulse just beyond perception, and a creeping certainty that something beneath them is listening. These shared experiences are not coincidence. They are evidence of a process that scholars tentatively call cognitive resonance. Exposure to certain symbols, geometries, and sounds primes the human brain to detect patterns that are encoded in the Earth's geomagnetic field. These patterns predate memory, language, and individual thought, yet they are accessible through the relaxed state of sleep. The narrative draws you closer. You are told that when you dream of water, someone else dreams of drowning. When you dream of drowning, another dreams of awakening. The connections are not linear. They are tidal, moving in overlapping cycles, rippling outward, folding perception back upon itself. Each dream is a node, each subconscious impulse a thread connecting you to the vast mesh of resonance that underlies existence. The principle is indifferent. It does not punish, it does not reward, it simply aligns. The narrator emphasizes that this alignment has both subtle and cumulative effects. Long before the idea of R'lyeh is recorded, before texts codify names and geometries, this alignment has been quietly operating, bringing the minds of humans into a loose but coherent phase with the older mind beneath the deep. The second-person tone deepens. You are implicated simply by observing, by imagining, by permitting your mind to entertain shapes, sounds, and rhythms that feel alien yet familiar. Water, corridors, green light, humming. These are anchors that allow the older resonance to fold into your perception. This process is not instantaneous, not violent, not spectacular. It is subtle, tidal, and unrelenting. The more minds align, the clearer the signal becomes. The narrator describes the human mind as having reached a threshold, a stage where it can host the signal without destroying it. Dreams are no longer random. They are circuits in a network, nodes that transmit, reflect, and amplify resonance. As the chapter progresses, the explanation becomes more chilling. Cthulhu is awakening not because he moves in space or rises in waves, but because humanity has cultivated the capacity to host the signal coherently. The principle has always existed, waiting for the alignment to reach critical mass. This awakening is cognitive, metaphysical, and collective, yet it is experienced individually through dreams that feel intimate, private, and uncanny. Each shared motif, each recurring sensation, each moment of unexplainable recognition becomes evidence that the network is alive, active, tidal. The narrator insists that this is not horror as traditionally conceived. It is a mechanism of alignment, an older mind folding into younger minds. You feel almost imperceptibly that your own dreams are implicated, that your imagination, your memory, and your sleep are instruments in a system that stretches across time, culture, and geography. Subtle sensory anchors punctuate the narrative: the soft hiss of water, the feel of cold green light on skin, the hum of vibration, the descent of corridors, each an interface between the mind you occupy and the older mind beneath the ocean. The chapter moves with deliberate cadence, weaving neuroscience, psychology, and metaphysics into a singular explanation. You are encouraged to notice patterns, to feel resonance in your own perception, yet without panic, without urgency. The process is natural, tidal, inevitable. By the conclusion, the mechanism becomes clear. The awakening is cognitive, a resonance unfolding in the minds of humans capable of perceiving it, facilitated through dreams, memory, and subconscious alignment. The implication is subtle yet profound. The signal is already present, waiting for coherence, waiting for attention. And in that final turn, the narrative leaves you with a quiet, inexorable understanding. Cthulhu is awakening because the human mind has reached a stage where it can host the signal more clearly. You are implicated simply by noticing, and the tides are moving toward clarity. The chapter presents a pseudo-neuroscientific and pseudo-psychological framework, describing how sleep softens ego boundaries and allows older patterns to surface, making the human mind capable of hosting the resonance of Cthulhu. Shared motifs, sinking corridors, humming vibrations, green light, and the sense of being observed are described as evidence of cognitive resonance, a process whereby symbols, geomagnetic patterns, and subtle environmental cues synchronize minds across space and culture. The second-person narration implicates the viewer, suggesting that their own dreams participate in this tidal alignment, and that alignment is not linear, but cyclical and cumulative. The chapter emphasizes that awakening is not a physical event, but a cognitive and metaphysical one. Humanity's growing mental complexity has reached a stage that can host the signal coherently. Concrete sensory motifs anchor the abstract ideas, maintaining immersion while demonstrating the principle's subtle operation. Chapter 3 concludes with a chilling revelation. Cthulhu is awakening not by moving in the world, but because the collective human mind has become an instrument capable of hosting and amplifying his signal, preparing the viewer for the exploration of consequences, subcases, and pantheon interactions in the next chapter. The focus shifts now from the mind to the structure beneath the waves, from dreams to the architecture of impossibility. Reshape is no mere city. It is a living, shifting structure, an echo encoded into the ocean's memory. Scholars speak of it as an architectural echo, a form not built for habitation, but for recollection, for resonance. Its angles fold reality as a dream folds narrative, abruptly, fluidly, without apology or precedent. You are led through reports from fictionalized explorers, sailors, and oceanographers, each account a fragment, each observation contradictory, yet linked by an ineffable pattern. Instruments fail near the region. Compasses spin in rhythms that resemble thought more than magnetism. Sonar returns reflections that cannot be resolved into geometry known to human minds. Some claim the water thickens, becoming viscous as if it remembers every step of the city's design. Some claim to hear chanting beneath the waves, low and repetitive, neither language nor noise, but something in between. None agree on the city's shape. Some describe towers folded into themselves, corridors that double back in impossible angles, rooms that lead both nowhere and everywhere. You begin to understand that reshape is not merely spatial, but temporal and cognitive. It is a mask the ocean wears when it wants to resemble stone, a structure that breathes in rhythms measured in tides rather than hours. Every corridor is both inside and outside, every surface a reflection of some larger, unknowable symmetry. The chapter emphasizes that the city exists as a principle. It is observed, interpreted, and inhabited in thought before any physical approximation appears. It folds perception around itself, bending not only instruments, but also imagination, expectation, and memory. As the narrative continues, you hear of the subtle effects on humans who linger near these coordinates. Anxiety becomes indistinguishable from intuition. Curiosity is inseparable from foreboding. Scholars note that structural impossibility induces a form of awareness unique to those exposed. The mind begins to perceive the folds of reality as both fixed and fluid, as if cognition itself is reshaping the ocean. The ocean, in turn, mirrors cognition, creating a recursive loop in which the observer is observed by the principles embedded in waves, stone, and memory. You are drawn closer by second-person implication. When you imagine the city imagines you. Your perception becomes an interface. Sensory anchors punctuate the narrative: the thickened smell of salt and brine, the vibration of water beneath hulls, the faint shimmer of impossible geometry on sonar screens, the low chant vibrating through bone and water alike. Each moment reinforces the principle that reshape is not meant to be mapped or conquered. You are not a visitor in the conventional sense. You are participating in an encounter that exceeds conventional spatial logic. The narrative weaves tension and calm simultaneously. You are aware of imminent collapse even as the water remains undisturbed, a paradox reinforced by sensory detail. The chapter emphasizes that the city is not rising as a physical object. Rather, The world itself folds to accommodate it. Time, perception, and matter behave differently in proximity to Erlea, demonstrating that structural horror is not an external threat, but an internal realignment of what is possible. By the conclusion, the principle becomes clear. If the city rises, it does not rise into the world. The world rises into it. The statement is not a metaphor, but a condition, a tidal inevitability that sets the stage for the next chapter, where case studies and pantheon expansions will illuminate how these shifts manifest in human experience. The city, though unseen in traditional senses, exerts influence in measurable and immeasurable ways, proving that the horror is structural, systemic, and recursive. Every reported failure of instruments, every sensation of viscous water, every perceived chant is a sign that reality itself is partially folded into the architecture of memory and principle. You are implicated not merely as a viewer, but as a participant in this alignment. To consider Erlea is to feel the pull of its angles, the resonance of its corridors, the sigh of its chambers folding inward. The chapter ends with a quiet, chilling insistence. The city does not merely exist in space, it bends the space around it, and in doing so, bends all who perceive it. The conditions of its existence are not optional. By the end, you are left poised on the edge of understanding, aware that what comes next, cases, encounters, pantheon expansions, will not only describe events, but demonstrate the consequences of structural alignment, of cognition entangled with architecture and principle, and of reality itself rising into the city. The narrative collects accounts from explorers, sailors, and scholars to illustrate a phenomenon that defies physical measurement. Compasses spin, sonar reports impossible geometries, water thickens, and chanting resonates beneath the waves. Relief is framed as an architectural echo, a mask the ocean wears when it desires to resemble stone, a labyrinth without an interior because every space folds inward. Structural horror dominates. Reality bends around the city rather than the city revealing itself. Sensory motifs, vibrating water, low chants, impossible angles, and thickened salt air anchor abstract ideas while reinforcing the concept of perceptual participation. The chapter emphasizes recursive interaction. Human perception and the city's principle fold into one another, implicating the viewer in the alignment process. By the conclusion, the narrative establishes a chilling condition. If Relief rises, it does not rise into the world rises into it. This principle sets up the next chapter, which will explore case studies and pantheon expansions, showing how these structural shifts manifest in human experience and further implicate perception in the awakening of Cthulhu. This chapter opens by shifting focus from principle to manifestation, from abstract resonance to the tangible traces left in human experience. 3 cases, long obscured or forgotten, illustrate the subtle but persistent spread of Cthulhu's influence, each highlighting a different vector: scientific observation, cultural ritual, and psychological devotion. The first, known only as the Atacama Surveyors, concerns a small team of geologists charting unusual mineral deposits in a remote desert valley. Their instruments behaved erratically, compasses spinning not from magnetic interference, but from something deeper, a subtle realignment of cognitive perception triggered by local geomagnetic anomalies that mirrored patterns described in ancient oceanic myths. They reported visions of spirals folding into the sand, shadows that seemed to breathe, and, at night, low hums rising from the desert floor. By the time their journals were recovered, many entries were crossed out or overwritten with undecipherable symbols. The second case, the Rangiroa Choir, occurred in a remote Polynesian atoll. A group of singers had preserved traditional chants whose meaning had long been lost. When performed during high tide, listeners reported synchronized dreams, corridors folding beneath water, greenish light rising into peripheral vision, and the sensation of being both observer and observed. Anthropologists who studied these performances noted that the participants' EEG patterns exhibited synchronization unusual for untrained subjects, suggesting a neurological alignment induced by ritualized sound. The third case, the glass mask pilgrim, concerns an individual in Northern Europe who underwent a prolonged psychological descent, documenting the slow internalization of patterns from dreams, maritime myths, and abstract geometry. They created a mask of translucent glass with spirals etched into it. When worn, the mask did not obscure the face, but refracted light and perception in ways that seemed to activate shared imagery among observers. Brief hallucinations of corridors, whispers, and movement beneath surfaces. In each instance, the contagion spreads not through sermons, proclamations, or written commands, but through symbols, experiences, and ritualized perception. The Atacama surveyors internalized resonance from geography and pattern. The Rangiroa Choir channeled resonance through sound and collective alignment. The glass mask pilgrim embodied resonance through a physical artifact and personal obsession. These cases collectively reveal that cults, in the traditional sense, are mischaracterized. Those who appear to worship Cthulhu are not summoning him, pleading for his attention, or performing incantations to elicit intervention. They are synchronizing with the principle, folding their cognition into the same alignment that allows the older mind to propagate through human hosts. The chapter emphasizes that the contagion is not coercive, but permissive, a quiet structuring of perception and experience that operates through interaction with symbols, rituals, and artifacts, rather than through fear or supplication. The second-person narration implicates the viewer once more. The more you observe patterns, the more your perception aligns with latent structures of cognition seeded across culture and time. Sensory anchors punctuate the narrative as the desert hum of Atacama, the rhythmic tides of Rangiroa, and the glinting spiral on the glass mask guide your attention and reinforce immersion. These details create a subtle tension. The contagion is everywhere and nowhere, distributed yet cumulative, recognizable yet ineffable. By the conclusion, the principle of alignment becomes clear. The contagion spreads because human cognition is receptive, because symbols resonate in minds predisposed to perception, and because the older mind beneath the waves acts indirectly, shaping potentialities rather than dictating outcomes. Cults, rituals, and artifacts are not vehicles of worship. They are instruments of synchronization, nodes in the ongoing propagation of resonance. The chapter closes with an implicit warning. Participating in these networks, observing these patterns, or entertaining their echoes is sufficient to draw a mind into alignment. The inevitability is understated but profound. The signal continues to propagate because the human mind, collective and individual, is structured to host it. The final imagery returns to Orlae, dreams, and tidal cognition. connecting these discrete cases back to the principle introduced in earlier chapters. Each case reinforces the overarching theme that awakening is not external, but distributed, a network of perception and resonance that folds reality, consciousness, and memory into alignment with the older mind. As the chapter fades, you are left with the understanding that human culture itself functions as an amplifier, that the signal is cumulative, and that the difference between observer and participant is one of awareness rather than action. The chapter's soft cliffhanger is implicit. By recognizing patterns, by following symbols, the viewer is already implicated in the tidal alignment, and the next chapter will explore the philosophical and modern echoes of this phenomenon, connecting the cases to cognition, culture, and cosmology. The Atacama surveyors encountered geological patterns that disrupt instruments and perception, revealing cognitive alignment with geomagnetic resonance. The Rangiroa choir synchronizes through ritualized chants, inducing shared dream motifs among participants, demonstrating collective neural resonance. The glass mask pilgrim embodies alignment through a physical artifact, creating perceptual distortions and shared visions among observers. Each case emphasizes a different modality: scientific, cultural, psychological, showing that the contagion of Cthulhu's principle propagates through indirect interaction rather than coercion. The chapter reframes cults and rituals. Practitioners are not worshippers, but participants in a synchronization with the older mind beneath the ocean, folding their cognition into a network of resonance. Sensory and environmental anchors, desert hums, tidal rhythms, and spiral etchings ground the abstract ideas while reinforcing the participatory nature of alignment. By the conclusion, it is clear that exposure to symbols, rituals, and artifacts is sufficient to draw minds into resonance. The chapter sets the stage for the next segment, which will explore philosophical synthesis and modern echoes, linking these cases to cognition, culture, and cosmology. The ocean is not merely water. It is an archive, a repository of memory older than any written text, older than human observation. In this chapter, you are invited to reconsider waves not as movement, but as records, currents not as energy, but as the echoes of thought that predate thought itself. Every swell, every whisper of tide against shore carries encoded patterns that ripple through space and time. The narrator emphasizes that Cthulhu's dreams extend beyond the confines of relief or human cognition. They shape currents, fold water into geometry that humans only perceive indirectly, in intuition, in anomaly, in the inexplicable tug at perception that we name awe, dread, or curiosity. Waves are memory, the narration insists, and water remembers more than those who walk upon its edges can comprehend. Human ancestors evolved near coasts, along river mouths, and beside shallow seas where these patterns were strongest. Their survival was not determined solely by sight, speed, or strength, but by the ability to perceive and respond to subtle rhythms that mirrored older resonances, rhythms that resonate with what the narrator calls tidal cognition. You are told that patterns in waves and foam and reflected light were not mere coincidence. They encoded instructions, alignments, and echoes of an older mind waiting to reconnect with the developing human consciousness. These echoes did not require language, they required attention. Children learning to walk on sand unconsciously practiced alignment with these resonances, Fishermen reading tides, hunters following the whisper of currents, all participated unknowingly in a subtle synchronization, their minds shaped by patterns older than survival itself. The chapter introduces pseudo-scientific language without becoming literal, describing water as a medium for cognitive resonance. Waves transmit information, currents encode geometry, reflections store memory. All of it passes through human perception, registering in ways difficult to quantify yet persistent enough to leave traces in culture, ritual, and dream. The narrator repeatedly returns to the second-person perspective. When you imagine a wave breaking, when you watch water fold over itself, the motion is not neutral. It resonates within you, drawing your attention into patterns that are both ancestral and alien. Sensory anchors abound: the taste of brine on lips, the smell of wet stone, the cool touch of surf on bare feet, the rhythmic pulse of tide against sand, all are cues that link human perception to the oceanic archive. Memory, cognition, and resonance are inseparable. Humans do not merely observe water. Water observes, reflects, and shapes cognition. By mid-chapter, the narration introduces the philosophical implication. Cthulhu's influence is not imposed upon humans from outside. It is woven into the substrate of perception that developed in the cradle of shorelines and shallows. Every human carries a fragment of this resonance, encoded in neural structures tuned over millennia to subtle environmental signals. These signals, largely unconscious, form a baseline predisposition to perceive alignment, pattern, and resonance in the world, even before the idea of Cthulhu enters awareness. The ocean archives accumulate this information, storing cycles of thought and perception, echoing through the tides in forms visible only indirectly. Anomalous currents, the greenish shimmer before storms, the rhythm of waves that seem almost intentional. The chapter emphasizes that memory is not only stored in neurons nor only in text, but in matter and medium, in water and stone. Human culture, from early rituals to modern mythology, is a reflection of alignment with these patterns. The ocean's archive is vast, patient, and indifferent, yet it interacts with human cognition precisely because cognition evolved in concert with these patterns. You are implicated simply by observing, by imagining, by listening to waves and remembering their motion. Every visual, tactile, and auditory cue ties you to a long lineage of ancestral resonance, revealing that the awakening of Cthulhu is partly facilitated by a continuity embedded in human evolution itself. The narrative concludes by linking memory, water, and resonance. Humans do not encounter Cthulhu as a new principle. They recognize fragments of an older alignment already embedded in perception. The subtle implication is chilling. The tides you see, the waves you hear, and the patterns you unconsciously follow are carriers of an archive older than culture, older than language, older than conscious thought. And as the chapter closes, the curtain is drawn subtly. By understanding water as memory and waves as instruction, you realize that humans themselves are conduits of ancient resonance, poised to amplify the alignment already initiated in dreams, symbols, and structure. The stage is set for the next chapter, where philosophy, modern culture, and cognition intersect to show the persistence and inevitability of Cthulhu's influence across time. Cthulhu's influence is expressed through currents and tides that reflect the resonance of an older mind, shaping perception, intuition, and ancestral cognition. Human evolution along shores and shallow seas is presented as intimately tied to these patterns, with early humans unconsciously synchronizing with subtle rhythms in waves, foam, and reflected light. The chapter emphasizes that memory is not confined to neurons or text, but exists in the medium itself, transmitted through sensory cues and environmental alignment. Sensory anchors, taste of brine, sound of surf, cool touch of water, tie abstract ideas to tangible experience, implicating the viewer in this continuum. The principle of tidal cognition reveals that humans carry fragments of ancient resonance, making them predisposed to perceive and host alignment. By the conclusion, it is evident that awakening is facilitated by evolutionary continuity. Humans themselves are conduits of older cognitive patterns encoded in water. This sets up the next chapter's exploration of philosophical synthesis and modern echoes, connecting the archival memory of oceans to the persistence of resonance in contemporary cognition, culture, and symbolism. As you continue to perceive the alignment, the narrative expands beyond Cthulhu to the wider pantheon, not as personalities, not as gods with whims, but as structures, as principles operating on cosmic scales. Each entity is introduced less as character than as mechanism, a function woven into the architecture of reality, and each resonates with human cognition in ways subtle, persistent, and inevitable. Azathoth, for instance, is not a being to be feared or supplicated. It is entropy, the background pulse of disorder that underpins existence itself. Its function is absolute yet invisible, manifesting as randomness, collapse, and the unmaking of structures when they overreach coherence. You sense it in every fractal pattern, every imperceptible breakdown in matter, in the decay of civilizations, and in the quiet moments when expectation fails. The narrator emphasizes that you cannot observe Azathoth directly. It is not a spectacle, but a rhythm, an omnipresent tremor in the substrate of reality, registering only through consequences, the silent note at the center of all creation. Nyarlathotep functions differently. It is not chaos, but signal, a principle of transmission, alignment, and interaction. It threads through human perception, manifesting in dreams, symbols, and ideas, much like Cthulhu. But its role is communication and interface. Nyarlathotep does not act. It facilitates. It is the tidal pull of patterns toward coherence, the resonance that aligns cognition across space, culture, and history. It is the echo in the choir, the pulse in the corridor, the whisper in the green light. And yet, it is indifferent. It does not guide morality or intention, only information, leaving human observers to misinterpret, mythologize, or worship what is merely function. Shub-Niggurath, in contrast, operates as reproduction, proliferation, and amplification of principle. It is not life in the human sense, nor fertility in ritual, but the mechanism by which resonance replicates itself, seeding ideas, patterns, and cognitive alignments across hosts and cultures. Where Cthulhu aligns minds through tidal cognition, Shub-Niggurath ensures the continuity of that alignment, multiplying nodes, generating networks, and sustaining propagation over time. The narration emphasizes that these functions are complementary, interdependent, and structural. They do not act like characters with agency or motive. They act like rules embedded in the architecture of existence, functioning regardless of human recognition, myth, or culture. Sensory anchors persist, ensuring immersion. The trembling of a city folding inward, the hum beneath waves, the greenish shimmer in dreams, the whisper of entropy in collapsing systems. Each is a cue to perception, a signal of underlying function, a marker of alignment. You are drawn into awareness that the pantheon is not a hierarchy of divinities, but a taxonomy of cosmic mechanisms, each principle expressing itself in distinct yet interlinked ways. Cthulhu triggers alignment and observation. Azathoth enforces the background of entropy. Nyarlathotep transmits patterns. Shub-Niggurath multiplies hosts and networks. Together, they form a functional ecosystem of cosmic resonance, each element operating as part of a larger structure that humans perceive partially, often misinterpreted as narrative, personality, or deity. The second-person tone implicates you again. As you consider these principles, as you notice their manifestations in culture, myth, or personal observation, you are engaging with the system. Your awareness, imagination, and cognition are nodes in a network whose architecture predates individual consciousness. The chapter emphasizes pattern and function over story or spectacle, framing horror not in confrontation, but in recognition. To see the mechanisms is to feel the pull of inevitability, to understand that alignment and propagation are ongoing, indifferent processes in which you are implicated. By the conclusion, the pantheon is fully reframed. It is not a set of gods to appease or narratives to follow, but a lattice of cosmic mechanisms, each principle observable through consequence, pattern, and resonance. You realize that the awakening of Cthulhu interacts with these other structures, creating a systemic effect across perception, cognition, and reality itself. The chapter closes with a subtle cliffhanger. Understanding function does not grant immunity. Observation is participation. Recognition is alignment. And as each principle continues its operation, you are already woven into the network, poised to experience the philosophical, modern, and cognitive echoes explored in the following chapters. Cthulhu functions as alignment, bringing human minds into resonance with older patterns. Azathoth is entropy, the underlying pulse of disorder and collapse, imperceptible yet universally effective. Nyarlathotep operates as signal, transmitting patterns, facilitating alignment, and connecting nodes of cognition without intention or moral guidance. Shub-Niggurath represents reproduction and propagation, multiplying networks of alignment and ensuring continuity of resonance across time and culture. Together, these principles form a structural ecosystem of cosmic function, operating independently of human perception, yet partially manifesting through observation, symbols, and dreams. Sensory and narrative anchors, folding cities, hums beneath waves, green light, and whispers of entropy reinforce the functional nature of these principles. The second-person narration implicates the viewer. Recognition of patterns is participation, observation is alignment, and cognition itself becomes a conduit. By the conclusion, the pantheon is no longer a hierarchy of gods, but a lattice of interlinked cosmic mechanisms. This sets the stage for the next chapter, which will explore philosophical synthesis and modern echoes, connecting these functional principles to human cognition, culture, and the persistence of resonance in contemporary perception. The narrative now shifts from principle and myth to modern observation, from resonance embedded in dreams and oceans to the technologies and methodologies humans have devised to detect the subtle mechanics of alignment. You are led to consider deep-sea hydrophones, instruments designed to listen to the ocean's pulse, capturing vibrations imperceptible to the untrained ear. Scientists report hums, pulses, and modulations in frequency that seem to follow no known geological or biological source. Patterns emerge that mirror the spirals, rhythms, and greenish luminescence previously described in ancient myth and dream accounts. The narrator emphasizes that these are not coincidences nor embellishments. The ocean retains memory, and instruments tuned to its motion are inadvertently reading traces of older alignments. You are drawn into the second-person perspective. Imagine listening through a hydrophone to the low-frequency pulse of currents, the faint murmur beneath waves, a signal that exists independently yet interacts with cognition in subtle ways. Parallel to these oceanic discoveries, modern neuroscience reveals phenomena that echo tidal cognition. Researchers studying neural synchrony observe that in groups of humans performing rhythmic tasks, singing, dancing, or meditating, their brain waves begin to align in measurable patterns. These alignments resemble the shared experiences reported in Rangiroa choirs, in pilgrimages, and in ritualized observation of symbols. The narrator emphasizes that the mechanism is structural, not spiritual. Humans are predisposed to resonance through physiology, culture, and history. Even the most rigorous scientific framework cannot fully explain why these alignments occur, only that they do, that patterns emerge spontaneously across time, space, and population. You are encouraged to perceive that the modern validation is partial, yet telling. The principle behind Cthulhu and other cosmic mechanisms is not literal in the scientific sense, but functional. It operates through measurable, repeatable phenomena that scientists may describe in terms of waveforms, neural coherence, and geomagnetic fluctuations. Yet its underlying pattern remains metaphysical. The chapter introduces sensory and conceptual anchors to maintain immersion. The low hum of a hydrophone, the shimmer of reflected sonar waves, the subtle synchronization of brain rhythms, and the tactile sensation of water against skin. Each anchor reinforces continuity, bridging ancient resonance with contemporary observation. The narrative emphasizes that these modern discoveries, while framed in empirical language, echo the same structural principles described in earlier chapters: alignment, contagion, resonance, and amplification. Even without invoking mythology, human cognition, environmental interaction, and technological measurement converge on the same underlying phenomena. You are reminded that the line between observation and participation is thin. By attending to these patterns, imagining their implications, and considering the consequences of alignment, you are implicated in the network of resonance that has existed since the evolution of shore-bound ancestors and persisted through ritual, symbol, and dream. The chapter stresses the meta-principle. The mechanics of cosmic alignment are observable, measurable, and yet not entirely reducible to conventional explanation. The ocean archives, human cognition, and cultural transmission converge with modern science to reveal that the principle of resonance operates consistently across epochs, contexts, and methodologies. You perceive that the awakening of Cthulhu, once framed as ancient myth, is mirrored in the modern study of neural synchrony, waveforms, and geomagnetic patterns. These discoveries do not require belief. They require observation, attention, and recognition of patterns across scales, from neuronal oscillations to tidal currents. By the chapter's conclusion, the implication is clear. Modern science, despite its empirical rigor and skepticism, inadvertently validates the mechanisms described in earlier chapters. The principle is structural, pervasive, and indifferent to interpretation. Observation is not neutral. it participates in the alignment, implicating both observer and instrument in the ongoing propagation of resonance. The narrative closes with a quiet insistence. The cosmos operates through pattern and function, and human ingenuity, whether in ancient chants, masks, or hydrophones, merely amplifies the visibility of these underlying structures. You are left with an understanding that the resonance of Cthulhu and associated principles continues to unfold, observable not only in myth and dream, but in the emerging intersections of contemporary science, cognition, and environmental interaction, setting the stage for the next chapter's philosophical synthesis and reflection on human implications. Deep-sea hydrophones detect low-frequency pulses, hums, and vibrations that follow no conventional source but echo, the spirals, rhythms, and greenish luminescence associated with Cthulhu and reshape. Parallel research in neuroscience demonstrates neural synchrony during collective rhythmic activity, echoing shared dream experiences and ritualized alignment. These findings illustrate that cosmic resonance operates structurally through measurable patterns in both environment and cognition. Sensory anchors, such as underwater hums, reflected sonar waves, and the tactile rhythm of water, connect abstract principles to tangible experience. The chapter emphasizes that observation is participation, human attention, and instrumentation interact with underlying patterns, facilitating alignment without conscious intent. Modern science, despite empirical rigor, inadvertently validates the mechanisms of tidal cognition, contagion, and structural resonance described in earlier chapters. The narrative reinforces that cosmic principles operate independently of belief, yet manifest consistently across epochs, environments, and cultures. This chapter sets the stage for philosophical synthesis, demonstrating that human cognition, cultural practice, and scientific observation converge in a continuum that both reveals and participates in the awakening of Cthulhu and related cosmic mechanisms. The boundary between observer and participant dissolves in this chapter. You are no longer simply learning about Cthulhu, reshape, or the principles of the pantheon. You are being implicated in their unfolding resonance. The narration, gentle yet inexorable, reminds you that listening is alignment. Each detail, each echo of the greenish shimmer, each whispered pattern in dreams, folds into your awareness not as abstract knowledge, but as active principle. You realize that knowing is never neutral. Awareness itself is participation. The chapter emphasizes that the idea acts on you. It does not merely exist. By paying attention, by tracing the patterns, by imagining corridors folding beneath the waves, you become a conduit, a node in the network of resonance. Sensory anchors keep you grounded. The faint pulse of water beneath your imagined feet, the subtle hum vibrating through the spaces of your mind, the greenish flicker that dances across imagined surfaces. Each element is both description and interface, guiding your perception while demonstrating the very mechanisms it describes. The second-person framing deepens. You feel the pull of tidal cognition in your own neural rhythms, the subtle synchronization with older, slower patterns encoded in water, stone, and memory. Historical accounts, dream motifs, and modern science converge in your awareness, reinforcing the continuity of alignment. It becomes apparent that Cthulhu's awakening is not an event witnessed externally, but a state co-created through perception and attention. The chapter explores the psychological implications. By understanding patterns, you modify your own cognition. By tracing spirals, corridors, or chants, you internalize the structural resonance that previously seemed external. Alignment is cumulative, imperceptible, yet irreversible. Your mind, like the ancient shore-bound ancestors, responds to rhythm, pattern, and environmental cue, folding subtly into the older resonance. The narration emphasizes that you cannot remain untouched. The act of watching, listening, imagining, or reflecting is itself a form of synchronization. The metaphysical implications extend further. Observation is no longer passive. It participates in shaping outcomes, perception, and potentiality. You are warned subtly that knowledge has a cost, and the cost is transformation. Subtle, cumulative, tidal. By the chapter's midpoint, the narrative bridges cognition and structure. As your mind aligns, the city, the currents, and the principles respond in resonance, folding perception and reality into a shared interactive framework. This is not horror as spectacle. It is horror as structural inevitability. The chapter repeatedly returns to motifs established in prior chapters: folding corridors, hums beneath water, greenish light, tidal rhythm, to reinforce the active connection between observer and principle. Each motif becomes a thread, pulling your consciousness further into alignment. You are invited to sense the network in action. Dreams you may have forgotten, echo patterns discussed, environmental rhythms resonate within, and even attention itself becomes a conduit for tidal cognition. By the conclusion, the narrative makes explicit the core revelation. You are part of the myth. Listening aligns you. Knowing shapes you. The idea acts on you. There is no return to prior neutrality. You have entered a continuum in which perception, cognition, and resonance are inseparable, and in which your awareness participates in the systemic awakening described across all previous chapters. The chapter closes quietly but insistently. Your engagement, however passive it may feel, has already contributed to alignment, leaving you poised for the next chapter where the philosophical, ethical, and modern implications of this complicit participation are fully explored. The stage is set for reflection, synthesis, and the final echoes of cosmic resonance to fold through understanding, experience, and the inevitability of principle. The narrative emphasizes that listening aligns cognition, knowing shapes perception, and awareness itself becomes an instrument in the propagation of resonance. Sensory anchors, including the hum of water, greenish light, and folding corridors, guide the viewer's attention while simultaneously demonstrating the structural mechanics of tidal cognition. Historical accounts, dream motifs, and modern scientific observations converge in the viewer's consciousness, reinforcing the continuity and inevitability of alignment. The chapter stresses that observation is never passive. Paying attention to patterns and motifs creates synchronization between mind, environment, and principle. The implication is subtle but profound. Viewers cannot remain neutral, as perception itself acts as a conduit, folding them into the network of resonance. This chapter bridges cognition, metaphor, and structural principle, preparing the viewer for the philosophical synthesis and modern echoes that follow. By its conclusion, the viewer is fully implicated, aware that their attention and understanding have already contributed to the unfolding of cosmic alignment, making the awakening both inevitable and participatory. The chapter opens by drawing your attention back to the beginning, to the dimly lit theater, the curtain, the stage, and the audience you assumed you were merely observing. The narration softens yet deepens in tone, inviting reflection as it reframes the entirety of the awakening. Cthulhu is not rising, not emerging, not newly manifesting. The awakening is not something the cosmos is performing in the future. It is something that has always existed in the interstices of perception, cognition, and resonance. You are told, gently, that humans are awakening to him, not the other way around. Every dream you have ever had that shimmered with impossibility, every inexplicable pulse in water or air, every echo of an ancient chant or pattern embedded in culture, is part of the evidence of this awakening. The narrative revisits motifs long established, the folding corridors of Rillier, the greenish shimmer before storms, the hum beneath waves, the spirals etched into stone and sand. These are no longer separate anomalies. They are threads of a single, tidal network that has always existed, waiting for cognition to recognize it. Sensory anchors punctuate reflection, the slow inhalation of ocean air, the tremor of unseen currents, the brush of shadow across the corner of perception, the faint whisper of entropy threading through daily experience. The chapter emphasizes the inevitability of this alignment, not as threat, but as existential fact. Cognition, perception, and resonance have always been entangled with the oldest structures, and every act of attention is already a node within them. The narration circles back to the pantheon, reframing the cosmic principles discussed earlier. Cthulhu triggers awareness, Azathoth underlies entropy, Nyarlathotep transmits signals, Shub-Niggurath multiplies nodes, and all function independently of human desire, narrative, or chronology. Yet in recognizing these structures, in observing and understanding their patterns, you participate. You are implicated not through action, but through perception. Every reader, viewer, or dreamer has always been part of this continuum, and the concept of awakening is therefore internal, a realization, rather than an external event. The chapter bridges past and present. The ocean archives, the neural patterns, the cultural artifacts, and the modern scientific parallels converge to form a circular thesis. Human cognition has been predisposed to recognize alignment, and in doing so, humans themselves have catalyzed the awakening. The narration frames this as both revelation and reassurance. The principle is indifferent, neither malevolent nor benevolent, neither past nor future. It simply is. The unfolding of comprehension, the act of perception, the quiet alignment of awareness, constitutes the awakening. You are reminded of your own participation, gently implicated in a network that transcends history and geography. Sensory and metaphorical motifs are layered to reinforce the circularity. The stage has existed for millennia. The audience has always been present. The curtain has always been drawn back slightly, allowing observation without interference. The final passages emphasize continuity, inevitability, and the cumulative resonance of cognition. By revisiting prior chapters' themes, structural alignment, tidal cognition, Rillia's shifting geometry, neural synchrony, and symbolic contagion, the narration demonstrates that all layers of understanding contribute to the same underlying realization. Human awareness, attention, and observation are both the medium and the amplifier. As the narrative nears its conclusion, it establishes a quiet, existential truth. Nothing begins, nothing ends. The awakening is not a moment in the future, but a process ongoing since the first shorebound ancestors aligned with oceanic resonance, since dreams reflected deeper tides, since patterns persisted through myth, symbol, and culture. The chapter closes with a simple yet profound line, a revelation folded within the narrative. The curtain was open long before you arrived. It is not a warning, but an observation, a reflection of inevitability and continuity. The story leaves the viewer with an expanded cosmology, a sense of participation in timeless resonance, and an implicit seed for future exploration. The network of alignment continues, and awareness itself is part of the unfolding structure. By the chapter's end, the viewer understands that the awakening of Cthulhu, and by extension, the operation of cosmic principles, is not external, optional, or finite. It is intrinsic, perpetual, and intimately bound to cognition. The circle closes, the stage remains, and the audience has always been and will always be both observer and participant in the tidal unfolding of resonance that is the awakening. The chapter revisits motifs established throughout the series: folding corridors, greenish light, tidal hums, spirals, and Ralaya's shifting geometry, to illustrate the continuity of resonance and alignment. Human cognition, attention, and perception are revealed as central to the awakening. Observing, listening, and understanding participate in the structural processes that Cthulhu, the pantheon of principles, and tidal cognition have long enacted. The narrative emphasizes circularity, showing that the awakening has always been occurring and that humans themselves catalyze recognition and alignment. Cosmic principles: Cthulhu as awareness, Azathoth as entropy, Nyarlathotep as signal, Shub-Niggurath as reproduction, function independently of belief, yet human perception integrates with these mechanisms, amplifying their effects. Sensory and metaphorical anchors tie abstract concepts to experience, reinforcing the participatory nature of awakening. The final line, "The curtain was open long before you arrived," crystallizes the existential thesis. The stage, the network, and the resonance predate the observer, and all cognition participates in its continuity. The chapter expands the viewer's cosmology and sets a subtle hook for future exploration, leaving the awakening as both inevitable and intimately tied to human consciousness.